We've looked at event sourcing, we've looked at GDPR, and I've introduced you, by the sounds of it, to the Data Protection Act of 2018. All things you need to be aware of. Which leads us to the whole point of this talk. What do you think happens when the immutability of event sourcing meets these regulations? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to hold that question in your mind. I'm going to ask you to answer it in a moment. I'm going to give you some help first of all. And what I want to do with that, I want to break this down into some capabilities for software systems that you'll need to be able to implement. If you were to, well, hopefully you've all actually done GDPR compliance exercises in your firms, or you've been on the receiving end of one maybe, depending on what you do for a living. Can you give me some examples of the high-level requirements you've got to build into your software? Anybody?
Ability to scrub data.
Ability to scrub data, yep. Anyone else? Real high-level stuff.
Allowing customers to opt in rather than opt out.
Allow customers to opt in, okay. Any more?
Exporting for subject access requests.
Exporting for subject access requests, okay. Well, I'm going to take you through the list I've compiled for this talk. Now, one thing I want to make plain is this list is talking about the capabilities your software needs. I'm not talking about when those capabilities need to be triggered, what you would call policy if you like. I've deliberately separated that out because I don't know what personal data your organizations hold, and I don't know the circumstances when these capabilities need to be triggered. That's what your legal advice is for. And I'm not for a moment claiming that this list is exhaustive. The other thing you need to be aware of, those of you who've worked in regulated industries, you're well aware of the effect enforcement has over the regulations over time, how it provides clarity and often shapes and changes the regulations. Regulators regulate, legislators legislate. It's what they do. So even if this list was comprehensive today, it will go out of date. So when you're looking at all of these for your software, you need to be looking at these from the most flexible point of view possible. You cannot get away with taking this stuff and narrowing it down and trying to de-scope it as much as possible to make it as small a headache as possible. All you're doing is kicking the can down the road. And the less said about kicking cans right now, the better, hopefully. So the first requirement, all personal data must be stored securely. You've got to be able to identify the lawful purpose for each piece of data you've got. It's something your system needs to be able to do. And you've got to be able to do that for every single piece of processing you do with it. Now that has an implication. You may need to actually keep track of what pieces of data you fed into what algorithms, potentially. The ICO website does not cover this one way or the other, but that may be a consequence of the GDPR regulations. We mentioned about being able to get data for subject access requests. You must be able to retrieve all the data about any individual. You've got to be able to update it as well. And this is a good example where you're better off treating all data as something you'll want to update rather than just small amounts of it. Because the definition of personal data will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on where the person's from. And it will change in future. You need to be flexible on this. Mentioned about scrubbing. You've got to be able to get rid of the data as if you never had it in the first place. And again, that reminder that it explicitly covers backups and archives as well. If you've got personal data, but it's subject to a processing restriction request, you've got to make sure you're not using that data. Now, it's meant to be a temporary state of affairs while the dispute over the accuracy of the data is sorted. It's not meant to be a long-term thing, but you've still got to be able to do it. If you're handling stuff that falls under the definition of solely automated decisions, you've got to have a mechanism to be able to review it. And again, that implies that you need to know what data has been fed into that decision-making process. because you can't review it if you can't say what the inputs are. So there's a strong implication there. And you need the ability to override those algorithms if necessary, if you fall under that particular part of GDPR. Now, so far, none of these are unique to event sourcing. I'm not pretending that they are. I think it's important you've got a good overall view of GDPR before we dive into the details. When it comes to event sourcing, those systems present unique challenges. And now we're back to the question about immutability. So what do you think happens? How event sourcing might actually be able to comply with GDPR from what you've heard so far? Anyone want to have a guess? Okay. The answer from everyone in the room is the same as you'll find online. If you go looking at frameworks, you'll find most of them haven't written a single thing about GDPR compliance. Okay? You're not alone by any means. And the reason for that is it all comes down to what makes event sourcing unique. State and the way states handle. The problem really is state. We all work on traditional systems. So we have met many of these requirements by being able to edit state. That's how we solve many of the GDPR requirements, including the ones we've picked out. There's no state in the primary data store of an event sourcing system. You've got events, state is calculated. It's a process of playback. So there's no state to edit. You've got to recalculate. And just a reminder, it's the events that hold the personal data. That's your primary data store. It's the events you're focused on. Now, those of us who've worked on systems that have lived for years, you know how complicated even what seemingly simple things can get. If you've got events all being fed into these calculators in order to produce current state, that interaction can be complex. It can exceed the ability to keep it in your head, and it can exceed the ability to accurately work it out on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. That can be a problem. And once again, a reminder of where this personal data ends up. Primary data store is the event store, but it can also end up in the projection cache, and it can also end up in snapshots if you're using CQRS with event sourcing. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back over the GDPR requirements yet again, but just focusing on those that are specific to ES-CQRS and the challenges. I'm not going to tell you how to solve them, but I'm going to ask you some questions for you to take away if you're thinking of adopting event sourcing yourself. So, this requirement here, you don't see a lot of people talk about this one, about storing all data securely. Event stores can be specialist. Yeah, they may not be a traditional database with usernames and passwords. So if you're thinking of adopting event sourcing, you need to look at how the event store actually protects data. You can't say the system as a whole protects data. Every level of your architecture has to have its own safeguards in place, or you're potentially liable. Mention that there's the protection cache and snapshots. If the projection cache is something like memcache, is that secure? For example, have you set it up in a secure way? How do you meet the requirement for that? Something to think of. Being able to update any piece of personal data. This is the one people talk about online. If your event store is an append-only system, you cannot actually change the data in it. How do you correct that data? Anyone want to have a guess? You append more data. Okay, it's the only mechanism available to you. But if you're appending more data, that means you've actually still got the incorrect data as well. Remember what we said earlier about event stores being able to play back state for any point in time? If you're holding the incorrect data, that means you're potentially at risk of reusing that incorrect data to produce incorrect results. So are you meeting the requirement in those circumstances, the GDPR requirement? I don't see people talking about that. We've mentioned data scrubbing. Soft deletes will not do. It's got to be hard deletes. You've got to be able to get rid of it as if you never ever had it. If your event store is immutable, how do you delete data from that if you can't change it? How do you find the personal data that's in the projection cache and the snapshots in order to get rid of it? The mechanism for updating the projection cache is to rebuild it. That's how you do it. You drop it and you rebuild it. And then you've got to save more snapshots. But if you're rebuilding it, you may be using code that's changed over the last year or 2 years. So if I've come to you and I've said, delete my data, and you've been forced to do so, and then you rebuild your projection cache, can you guarantee you're not rebuilding anyone else's personal data at the same time? Can you guarantee that? Are you actually breaking other people's data and therefore breaking GDPR? Now, coming back to the event store for the moment, I did see one neat trick someone had come up with for event stores. And that the idea of actually the personal data, making sure it's ring-fenced in records that are encrypted. And their idea of deleting it is to put it beyond use by losing the encryption keys for that data so you can't retrieve it. Question is though, does it actually put it beyond use forever? Is it possible for future technology to come along where the encryption can be cracked? Quantum computing, for example, is that a risk factor? Does it mean you can't comply with the regulations if you do that trick? And once again, I just want to remind you, when you're scrubbing data, you've got to get rid of it from your backups and your archives as well. You can't hang on to it. I'm sorry if I'm ramming that down people's throats. It's something, something you really need to remember. Being able to avoid processing personal data while the accuracy of it is being disputed. If you're rebuilding state, how do you, and you're skipping over data, what's the implications of that? What's the impact of that? Are you just affecting that user's data? Are you affecting other people's data? Because if you're doing a projection rebuild and you've got this complex interaction of events, can you guarantee you're not affecting anyone else's personal data in a negative way? Have you designed your system for that? I mentioned this implication that comes up a couple of times when looking at GDPR, about you may need to actually know what pieces of data you fed into an algorithm. Now, traditionally, we do that by pulling backups and replaying back on a test system. That's how we've done it historically. But you haven't got that backup to work with. You haven't got that state. So if that implication is true for your organization, when you're using event sourcing, can you reproduce that state with 100% accuracy for that point in time? Can you do it? Chances are you can't. So does that mean when you're actually performing processing that falls under GDPR, does that mean you've actually got to archive the state you fed into those projections, not projections, the state you fed into the processing at that time in order to be able for users to challenge, to challenge those decisions? And these questions add up to one question above all else. Is it possible to have the benefits of event sourcing? That guarantee of being able, you've built a time machine that works on your data. Is it possible to do that and achieve GDPR compliance? What is it going to cost? And is it worth the hassle? And only you, if you're looking at doing event sourcing, can answer that. I can't answer that for you. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm not trying to say you shouldn't use event sourcing. What I'm trying to do is make sure if you're ever looking at event sourcing, you're going into it with a set of questions so you can make an informed decision of your own. That's what I'm trying to do. And to help with that, I just want to sum up by throwing some more things at you. GDPR is not something you bolt on. To comply with completely, it's foundational. It affects your business, and your IT systems affect those businesses and organizations. It's regulation. You need to be getting proper advice on this stuff. Now, when it comes to enforcement, We're at a very early stage of it. When I was researching this talk, I went onto the ICO website to see how enforcement was going on. It wasn't possible for me to easily see what enforcement has taken place. If memory serves, I was left with the impression the ICO website is mostly chasing people who send unsolicited texts and messages and things like that, and robocallers, rather than this. So we don't yet know what GDPR enforcement will look like. We don't know how hard the hammer will fall. We just don't know. But we can look at other regulated industries where we know that how regulations are enforced and how they're not enforced does shape the future advice. We can see that in other industries. Anyone's worked in telecoms or finance will be well aware of that. Now, from my point of view, based on my research for this talk, I can't see how you can have an immutable system that complies with GDPR. I don't think it's even up for debate. I don't see how you can do that. I think they're fundamentally incompatible. But it's up to you to make your own mind up. If I had a CTO hat on right now, there is no way I would adopt anything that relies on immutability if I'm handling personal data. Wouldn't take the risk. That's me personally. Not a chance. But if you are going to adopt it, as well as all those questions we've got before, I've got some more that you might want to ask. If you're picking an event sourcing framework, where is its documentation on how you can use it in a way to be GDPR compliant? Why hasn't the framework documented this? If they haven't documented it, chances are they've not thought of it. So you need to be aware of that. Yeah. If they have got documentation, who signed that off? When we look at security software, we look for security audits, don't we? We look for firms to say, yes, we've done an audit of this code. We believe it's secure. Where's the equivalent for any advice on GDPR that are given out by frameworks? Where is that? Make sure you ask that question. Because if the advice is just from the developers, that device is not qualified. And in a regulated environment, you shouldn't be using unqualified advice. You may be attending an event sourcing workshop at some point. And if you do, ask the same question to the person leading the workshop. They are probably experienced and they probably have answers to help you with this stuff, okay? But again, any advice they are giving needs to have been signed off by someone who's qualified to judge it because you're working in a regulatory environment. So where is their advice signed off by? Because at the end of the day, it's you who are doing the data processing or acting as the data controller who are legally liable. It's not the framework, it's not the consultant who's running the workshop. It's you because you're handling the data. So you need to take steps to make sure that you are compliant. What do you think? Have I put anyone off event sourcing for life, first of all? A few hands gone up there and a few nodding smiles. Have I said anything tonight that you think fundamentally needs challenging, first of all? Nope. I appreciate it's a lot to absorb. The slides will be up online when I get back to the hotel room tonight. Did you realize it was a topic quite of this scope? Nope. Okay. Now, fortunately, as developers, we don't seem to have individual liability. The liability seems to be on organizations. That's my personal understanding. But again, not a lawyer, could be wrong. But GDPR does change the world, and there's going to be more of it. There is more privacy legislation coming down the pipeline. This is not the end of it by any means. So it's good to get your head around this stuff. And the best way to do it, I find, is to work out what the right questions are for you and your organization. That's better than a cookie. Sorry, I'm tired. It's better than a cookie cutter answer. Is actually work out the questions that apply, like I've done tonight with this talk. There'll be other questions I've not thought of, because I've not implemented event sourcing in a GDPR environment, and I personally wouldn't. Doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm not here saying it can't be done, but it's got a lot of challenges that are different than if you're working on a traditional system. So any questions to finish? Nope. Stunned silence. Well, if you do think of any questions, you can always reach out to me on Twitter and I'll do my best to answer them. And again, if any of you end up doing your own research and you find additional questions, or you find that some of this doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you're doing your own research, I'd love to hear from it as well. I think as a community, the more we pull what we find about this, even when we don't disagree, I think the more we pull it, the better we all are for it, the better off we all are. Okay, well in that case, thank you very much.